Hey everybody, Steve Stedman here just to talk about this upcoming weather pattern that we have headed at us at Sandy Point and to see how it really impacts things. Somebody asked the question online of, am I worried or should we be worried? Well, there's two things that make me worried when it comes to Sandy Point and weather. One is extremely low pressure. The last three major flooding events we've had have been associated with pressure below 29. We are not very often below 29. There's only been, well, actually in the last 5 years or so, there's only been 3 times have been significantly below 29, and those have been associated with flood events. Okay. The second thing is big waves on the West Beach driving up over the houses on that side and up along Susha Drive. And I think that comes from what I've observed mostly of weather coming out of the northwest. So if we've got wind coming out of the east, nobody cares about the west side of Susha Drive because there's going to be no weather being pushed that way. But when the wind's coming out of the northwest, coming down the Straits of Georgia with a big storm up at Campbell River area or that way, that's where we see the biggest waves forming and striking and hitting the West Beach. So let's take a look and see at the weather forecast and see what kind of patterns are here and how this will impact things at Sandy Point. So I'm using the Weather Underground as my source of information when I'm looking at weather. And what we're seeing, this is looking at from Monday today, January 8th, looking at the 10-day forecast, or it looks like 9 days out through January 17th. And, okay, snow. I mean, really, what's the big deal with snow? It's not going to make any big impact other than maybe you don't go anywhere. Very rarely do we get enough snow. But when we do, yeah, some of the hills going on the S-curves out of Sandy Point, that may be a problem. So plan ahead on that. But what's interesting is the pressure, and we see that on the second chart here. We see that right now we're at the point on Monday afternoon, and the pressure is this black line, and the right side over here is where it shows the numbers. So right now, our pressure, and let me look real quick. Yeah, we're just shy of 30, or we're riding around 29.8 looking at my pressure gauge behind me. And then that's kind of about what it shows here on the forecast. We're just around 29.9, dropping overnight into tomorrow down to around 29.6, down to 29.4, but really nothing near 29.0. And where the pressure is important is that pressure correlates usually to higher tide levels. What you end up with is a high pressure zone somewhere else, maybe off the coast, low pressure zone here at Sandy Point, and the water kind of does that bathtub effect, like if you jumped in one end of the bathtub and it pushes all the water to the other end. And that's what we end up seeing with the low pressure. I mean, if it follows the forecast here, it's not that low. I mean, 29.5, I'm usually not too worried about that. Although, I mean, I would say it's higher risk certainly than other times of the year, and you should be prepared if you can. But just with that pressure level, I don't see too much flooding going on. And part of it is that pressure is going to be low tomorrow between about midnight tonight through the day tomorrow. And if we look at the tides, yeah, tomorrow we've got some high tides. Looking at, let's see, here we are, 1-9. It's low tide at night, high tide during the day, but our high tides are 9.48, 9.29, which is about a foot lower than the king tides that we had a couple weeks ago. And as we go into later this week and next week, the tides keep getting higher, up to 10.17 or so. Maybe our third or fourth highest tides of the year, but nowhere near the point that we saw last week. But if that gets combined with a low pressure zone, that's where I get worried. Fortunately, looking at the forecast here on this black line on this chart, that pressure keeps going up and up and up. And hopefully that pressure continues to go up, and that'll help us with, or help preventing the flooding. Now, when we look at what's going on with big waves and wind hitting the West Beach like we've had in the past, and if you live on Susha and you're concerned with those massive waves hitting your beach and driving into your yard, well, what you're going to be concerned with is winds that are coming out of the northwest. Now, if it's a true north wind or a true west wind, yeah, it's not that big of a deal usually. It's when it's coming out of the northwest and you've got this long stretch of water going up the entire Straits of Georgia that the waves are just going to build and build and build and get bigger. That doesn't happen when we get a south wind or even an east wind, because there's nowhere for those waves to build. And the size of the wave is usually determined by how strong of a wind there is over what length of a period you have for those waves to build. And if you have a super strong wind and it's only blowing over a few miles of water, you're not going to get the same size of waves as if it's a really strong wind pushing over 100 miles of water, like you get when it's coming from up near Campbell River area. Some of the biggest waves I've ever seen at Sandy Point have been on the West Beach when they've been pushing down that way. So looking at as we go through here, today we've got kind of northeast, not too worried on waves with that. And then we've got it tomorrow and the next day kind of coming out of the south mostly with the winds. Usually when the winds come out of the south, we don't get that big of waves. There's just not enough room for the waves to build because we've got too much land with Gooseberry Point, Lummi Island, Orcas, things like that to the southwest of us. We've got winds that'll start coming out of the northeast, and when the winds come out of the northeast, they don't really slam the West Beach like you'd expect, and they don't really slam the east side of Sandy Point so much at that point either, because the Lummi Bay side of it, the bay is just not big enough for those waves to get really big like you see when we get the northwest winds. So if this forecast holds true, where the lowest pressure we get is around 29.4 and we don't have any significant winds coming out of the northwest, then yeah, I think we'll probably be okay overall on the wind, on the overall weather. Now, that's just my guess. I don't know. I mean, I'm not a weatherman. Looking at that, that's my take on it. We'll see how it goes. I could be wrong. Hang in there, and let's just see what happens with this weather.